We're proud to welcome you to the Exceptional Advisor podcast series brought to you by the Investments and Wealth Institute. This series aims to help you to better serve your clients, differentiate yourself from the competition, and enhance your ability to communicate those differences. Hi, I'm your host, Bob Powell.
I am pleased to welcome today's guest, Rabbi Steve Leder. Rabbi Leder is the senior rabbi of the Wilshire Boulevard Temple in Los Angeles. He is the author of The Beauty of What Remains, The Extraordinary Nature of Ordinary Things, More Money Than God, and the bestseller, More Beautiful Than Before. He will also be the Institute speaker on ethics at the upcoming Wealth Advisor Forum this September, and here today to discuss what we learned from loss. So welcome to the podcast, Rabbi Leder.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. Your most recent book, The Beauty That Remains, came out in January of this year and is about loss. 2020 was a year of loss on many fronts with COVID. What do you think the biggest lesson learned as a society was after this year of loss, so to speak?
Well, if I had to distill it down to a single, fundamental message, I would say for any of us who were lucky enough to have a roof over our heads and food in the refrigerator, because let's realize that there were two different worlds going through this pandemic, and I think that needs to be said. But for any of us with a roof over our heads and who could work from home and had food to eat, I think the greatest lesson was something that we all say we know and believe, but our lives aren't always really aligned with that professed value, which is simply that it's who we have, not what we have, that makes life meaningful. And every person you ask will say, oh, of course, but were we really living that way? Were we home for dinner before the pandemic? Were we thoughtful about who we spent our time with? And did we live as if there's only a tiny handful of people who really matter and are worthy of our sacrifice and our time? And, did we live like our days are finite? Or did we just say things like life is short? So I hope, this is the beautiful part. This is partly why I called the book The Beauty of What Remains. These disruptive things in our lives, these losses, and there are many kinds of loss, not just death. There's the loss of a marriage. There's the loss of a breast. There's a loss of our sense of invulnerability, which we all lost during COVID. There is, a loss of a dream. It's a loss of a business. There's a loss of money. There are many types of losses, right? And the beautiful part of loss, without dismissing the horrible suffering that comes with so much of what loss means, is that it disrupts us. It shakes us up. It shakes us by the shoulders and it says, wake up. Wake up to this slender, melting thing we call life. And in that sense, it's a real opportunity. Pain is a great teacher. Death is a great and powerful teacher. And again, I am not dismissing the pain of it all, but there is some beauty in that too. And that if we embrace it, can really change our lives for the better. So I would say it was that this stark, disruptive reminder of how precious our lives and the lives of the people we love and who love us, how precious all of that really is.
So the book title, besides The Beauty That Remains, also says how our greatest fear becomes our greatest gift. Can you talk a bit more about what our greatest fear is? And
for most people, if you really drill down, even if they're in denial of death, which is a necessary way to live, particularly when we're young and in midlife and so ambitious. If you really ask most people and get to the basement of their psyche, it's a fear of death. I mean, all religion is a response to finitude. to the fact that we're going to die. You know, in a way, we're all afraid of the dark. However, what I realized in sort of thinking through this topic and writing this book about loss and about death, and the book is a combination of a memoir through my father's 10-year journey through Alzheimer's and what I learned as a son that I never understood as a rabbi, despite having officiated at over 1,000 funerals. And it's a field guide. It's a field guide through loss and what can we make of it all? You know, Dostoevsky said his greatest fear was that his life would not be worthy of his suffering. That's a powerful idea. Can we lead lives worthy of our suffering? So our greatest fear for most of us is death. Now what? How do we respond to that fear and use that fear to ennoble our lives, to bring worth and value to our lives, to bring meaning to our lives? And interestingly enough, this is something that virtually every interviewer, I don't know, I've done maybe 100 podcasts and all these TV shows and talk shows, and almost everyone is shocked by a simple fact, anecdotal fact in the book, which is I literally have been at the bedside of more than 1,000 dying people, and not one person, Bob, not one single person who is actively dying, and by that I mean within hours or a day or two of death, has been afraid. And I ask, Bob, how are you doing? Are you frightened? And the answer 100% of the time, and again, I know this is anecdotal, it's a small cohort, but the answer has always been no. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have fears. They have fears for others. They're worried about their kids. They're worried about their spouse, not worried about themselves, because as cliche as it sounds, when it's really your time to die, it's a very natural part of life, because most people die after some kind of very long battle with decline, with disease, and they're worn out. They're just worn out. And the best thing I can equate it to is when just imagine the worst jet lag you've ever had in your life. The worst. You're a zombie, right? All you want to do is crawl into bed and pull the covers over your head and go to sleep. You're not anxious about going to sleep. You're not afraid of going to sleep. You're not angry about going to sleep. It's just the most natural thing in the world. And that's the closest I can get to describing what I have witnessed for people who are really, really dying. Now, the good news about the fact that people who are actively dying are not afraid is, for those of us who are afraid of dying, if you're afraid of dying, here's some good news. It's not your day. Anxiety is for the living. If you are afraid of dying, you're fine. You're not dying that day, okay? When you're really dying, you won't be afraid. So this is a kind of counterintuitive point of view, but it's actually true.
Well, I'm glad to hear that I've got a few more days left in me.
At least.
But I have to share this personal anecdote, which is I used to look at my parents, both of whom are deceased now, and I used to think that my father didn't die because he feared death so much, and then my mother didn't die because she loved life too much. And they were very different motivations from my perspective. But in the end, my father died, I think, even though he feared death, because life wore him down to the point where he had to.
We have this idea that life is good, which it is. And therefore, if something is good, then more must be better. But there is a point in life where more is not better. And that's a hard thing to understand until you're there, or until you're witnessing a loved one who is there. But there are many things worse than dying. Many.
I have a list of questions, but I have to ask, you said you were by your father who had Alzheimer's, which is perhaps, along with maybe ALS, or to a degree cancer or diabetes, all of them, right? They are just horrific ways to go. And talk a bit more about that and the lesson you learned from being
There are a few things that I learned. First of all, when it comes to Alzheimer's, in my father's case, and in the case of many people with these dementia kinds of diseases, the good news is the disease comes with its own anesthesia for the afflicted. My father didn't know what he didn't know. It's painful for everyone else. I did take some comfort in the fact, and you know from the book, I had a very tough father and we had a complicated relationship. But Alzheimer's rounded all those sharp edges and softened him and left this essentially sweet man in its wake. So, but it's painful for everyone else. Another thing that Alzheimer's, my dad's condition, taught me is that, and this has really helped me with people at funerals who have had loved ones die similarly, who are shocked that they feel so awful when the person's actually gone. And my answer to them is, well, people with these kinds of diseases die twice. My father died twice. First, when he no longer knew who he was or who any of us were in his family or his friends. You know, a different person emerged in the vacuum of his mind. It wasn't my dad. So that's when he died the first time. And then he died again when his body died. And they are both really, really painful, and they're both losses. And that second loss is often very surprising to people who are like, well, I lost my dad 5 years ago when he stopped talking and he didn't know who I was. Well, you did and you didn't. It's both. The other thing I learned, and you know, so much of the book is about what the rabbi got wrong and the son now understood. So rabbis, like all clergy, are full of platitudes about memory, right? May his memory be a blessing. Shall live on in your memories. And it's true. Memory is beautiful. It's true. However, it is equally true that memory really, really hurts sometimes. There's a duality to memory that I had to make peace with. And I think that we all have to make peace with. In the book, I say it's like being caressed and spat on at the same time. That's memory. That's memory. And how do we hold on to the beauty of what remains in our memories and somehow mitigate, however possible, the sting of it all? You know, I thought that President Biden did a very good job in his inaugural speech, his inaugural address. And we all know he's suffered, you know, terrible loss. And he said, in order to heal, we have to remember, and it hurts to remember sometimes. And I don't think it can be better put than that. You know, that's the truth of it. And, you know, I also learned what a long road grief is, you know, and that it's not a destination. You know, I say in the book, anyone who thinks the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line doesn't understand grief, because grief is non-linear. I mean, you and I are roughly the same age, I'm guessing, and we were raised under the teachings, all of us, every Psychology 101 class, we were all raised under the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who assigned stages to death and to dying and death and stages to grief, which implies it's a linear process. First, you will feel A, then B, then C, then D, then E, and then you're done. And that's just not true. So I learned to think of grief much more like waves. They come very close together and they're very aggressive at first. And they do grow further apart. And sometimes you can have a week, a month, a year, a decade even, you know, with beautiful calm seas. And then your back is turned one day and this massive rogue wave of grief just rises up and just takes you down, you know. I see this at weddings where I see the grandfather, for example, of the bride just break down in the middle of the wedding. Why? We all know why. And he's been fine and he's been remarried for 15 years, you know? So now let's extend this wave, grief as wave metaphor a little further to something that I think is really beneficial to people. So if grief comes in these waves, you know, there are two ways to face a wave. So the Rabbi Steve Leder, before my dad died, my default setting was no matter what wave was coming at me, a wave of anxiety, a wave of hard work, you know, a wave of concern, a wave of illness, my default setting was, okay, here's what I do with waves. I plant my feet in the sand, I stick my chest out, and I take it. I hold my ground. And we all know what can happen to someone who does that. You know, you end up upside down, smashed against the rocks, gasping for breath and afraid. So what my father's death taught me and grief taught me is that the other way to deal with a wave when it's coming at you is to just lie down and let it wash over you and float with it. Just float with it until you can stand up again. And I also learned that when you're floating, it's a really good idea to reach your hand out and just see if there might be someone standing there next to you who can hold your hand and help lift you from that suffering, right? The Talmud says the prisoner cannot free himself, right? It's such a powerful thing that death comes to teach us and pain comes to teach us, which is to reach out for help. I was always the helper. And, I find that a much more honest way of describing grief and of living with grief. You never live without it. You live with it. Before my dad died, when I would help a family bury a child, which is the most difficult thing I ever have to do, I used to say to the parents, I obviously would get there super early and sit with them before the funeral. And I would sit down next to them and I would say, listen, the most honest and helpful thing I can tell you right now is that it won't always hurt so much. I don't say that anymore.
Yeah.
Because it isn't true. What I say now is, listen, the most honest and helpful thing I can tell you right now is it won't always hurt so often, because when it hurts, it really hurts. And these are the kinds of things I don't think I could have learned. I know I didn't learn with vicarious experience. And I've tried in the book to be as honest and open and transparent as possible so that people know they're not alone.
It's so interesting that for all those funerals that you officiated, it wasn't until you had to walk in their shoes.
Yeah, I'll give you the best example I can share with you of that feeling and that realization. Before the service for my dad, we got there early, and this very earnest young rabbi, who was the rabbi of my parents' synagogue, walked in and said and did all the right things, and then he walked us into the chapel to see my father's body before the casket was closed and the service would begin. And as we were walking in, I remember thinking to myself, I know exactly how the rabbi feels right now, but it's not at all how I feel right now. I'd walked 1,000 families down that path. I had stood prior to that day next to 1,000 families, shoulder to shoulder, staring into the casket of their dead loved one. And honestly, Bob, didn't affect me at all. Like, I could have eaten a sandwich. I was there for them, but it didn't bother me. It didn't move me. At almost 3 years ago, so let's say at 51 years old, 58 years old, because I'm 61 now, when we walked into that room, now you have to understand that my dad and I are almost physically identical. So if you saw a picture of my dad at 10 and a picture of me at 10, you wouldn't know the difference other than the clothing. So this is still hard for me to talk about. We walk in and I look at my father in the casket. I'm leaning over the casket and I look at my dad and I think to myself, that's exactly how I'm going to look when I'm dead. And my son is going to be leaning over my casket. And despite all those years of experience, Bob, it was at that moment that I realized I am going to die. And what does that mean for how I'm going to live? And I didn't get it until that moment that I saw my father's body and knew my son would be having that same experience, hopefully many years from now, but undoubtedly. And, and this was after seeing 1,000 bodies and being unmoved by it. So, I don't know how else to put it to you, except that is a very powerful, instructive moment. Death is the great teacher. Kafka said the meaning of life is that it ends.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
I prefer to say that the meaning of life is a life of meaning.
Well, I think we're circling around the same truth, because What meaning would a deathless life have?
Right.
Think about it. What if we led deathless lives?
God.
We would be something other than human.
Yeah.
No one would get married. No one would have children. Nobody would have any ambition. Nobody would change anything.
Yeah.
Wallace Stevens, I'm gonna badly paraphrase the poet Wallace Stevens, who basically said that the beauty of a flower is that it fades. Why are we unmoved by plastic flowers? Why doesn't anybody care about plastic flowers? Well, the reason is because they have no death. They have no life. They have no meaning. And that to me is that's how this great fear becomes a great gift.
So you said two things I want to ask you to comment on. One was this notion of the moment that you realize that you're going to die, that you have mortality. I think back to when my parents died, my mother died, and I remember thinking how precious life is, how short life is, and given that our days are finite, that I don't want to waste a moment of my remaining life. I want to make every day valuable. And while it seems like that feeling lasts for a little bit, it's hard for it to be persistent. I'm curious if you have thoughts about how people can sort of follow through on their desire to make sure that they live every day to their fullest and reach their potential, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, I'll tell you something. I have a friend who has an app on his phone, and it randomly sends him a text throughout the day a few times that says, "You are going to die." Now, I'm a little conflicted in recommending it because I also think there is a reason that we push finitude down into the basement of our subconscious, despite the fact that it sort of pounds on the ceiling with a broomstick. It's locked down there in the basement because it's pretty hard to operate in the world with that kind of fatalistic thinking if you see it as fatalism. But, for example, I'm a religious person, obviously. Jews have a prayer called the Mourner's Kaddish, and we say it 3 times a day. And it's even though it's a prayer that we say when we remember people we love who have died, it actually does not contain a single reference to death. It's all about the greatness and the goodness and the power and the beauty of God and the world God created. And if you don't like the word God, use science, use evolution. It doesn't matter to me. So I think there's a lot of value to the perspective that death grants us as we proceed through our lives. I will tell you one thing for me, since this is in a way a business kind of gathering around this podcast, right? People who deal with money a lot. From the book, my father was an enormously frugal person. He wasn't poor, but he was incredibly frugal. He reused his dental floss, Yeah, that about sums it up, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, he would look at my mother and say, "It's a perfectly good piece." So that was my dad, right? Yeah, he washed paper plates and put them in the drying rack, and what's beautiful about that is every time
Jackie Mason, never mind. We'll save that for another day.
Yeah. The beautiful thing about that is every time I leave a room and turn off the lights, I think about my dad. So there is this beautiful way that someone's death comes to remind us of their life and its influence on our life. But generally speaking, I think that I'm going to get to the money point. One of the permanent changes that it made for me is I made the decision to spend money on something I don't think I would have spent money on before my father died, which was that we're building a small getaway in the Joshua Tree Desert, because I realized, I want a place to hang out with my kids and future grandchildren, God willing, away from it all. I'm peaceful out there. I write well out there. What am I waiting for? So, there are some permanent sort of or long-lasting changes we can make, but I have a picture of my dad. It's on my shelves in my closet where I get dressed every morning. I have these reminders. And the point I think I'm going to make, the beautiful part of it is, yes, it's a reminder of death. It's also a reminder of the beauty of his life and mine. There's this duality that is very powerful, this dichotomous tension between death and finitude, and therefore the value of life itself. This dichotomous tension is the suspension bridge on which we all actually live.
So when you were talking about letting the wave carry you and reaching out for perhaps a helping hand, I'm reminded of the Jewish tradition of going to synagogue for 30 days after the passing of.
Well, if it's a parent, it's 11 months.
Right, 11 months. So, and to go say Kaddish with a community of people who are reaching out to you.
Correct. You cannot say that prayer with fewer than 9 other people, or you're not supposed to. Let me put it that way. You can do whatever you want. But yes, and I said it before, the prisoner cannot free himself. We have to reach out. I'll tell you something really beautiful someone said to me at what we call a Shiva Minyan, this prayer service that happens in the home of the bereaved family. This guy had lost his 30-year-old daughter in a car accident. She was killed in a car accident. Everyone's there praying together, singing together. And at the end, everyone's arms all around each other, swaying and singing this song about peace and wishing peace upon the mourner. And he looked at me and he said, "This changes nothing, but it means everything." That's what community is. It changes nothing and it means everything. People ask me all the time, "Steve, my friend from college was just diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. He's got 6 months to live. I don't know what to say. I'm going back to New York to see him. What do I say?" And I always answer with 3 words followed by 2 words. The first 3 words are, just show up. Just show up. Walk in the door, okay? And the second 2 words are very important. Be authentic. When you walk in that door, you don't need to walk in with this long, poorly acted kabuki face and this hushed tone. "Oh, Bob, I'm so sorry. Oh, I can imagine the pain and the misery." No, you need to walk in that door and be in the face of death who you have always been with that person in the face of life. If you're a joker, joke. If you're a hugger, hug. If you're a feeder, feed. If you're an errand runner, run errands. If you're a gossiper, gossip. Just walk in and be Bob, okay? Because that is what suffering people need. That is the only thing that assures them that the bottom hasn't fallen out of the entire world, that they're still them, right? Now, this is true for the dying and the grieving. I can tell you, after 34 years of being a rabbi, when I'm standing in the hall at a hospital before I walk in that room, or I'm standing on the front doorstep of a home before I walk through that door, I don't know what I'm going to say. I just know I need to walk in and be myself. That's what people want and need. And the good news about that is we all know how to do that. What we don't do very well is pretend to be someone we're not.
So we've talked a lot about the book. You'll be speaking at the Wealth Advisor Forum. I'm curious, what's the tie-in between your book, the lessons, and to the financial advisor who will be in the audience, but also maybe to the financial advisor who wants to be rabbi to their clients?
Yes. Well, so my next book, which will be out in June of 22, is called For You When I Am Gone, and it's about legacy. And it's a book. There are 12 chapters, and there are 12 questions that I ask. I write essays about and ask the reader to ask for him or herself and answer, and then to go off and create what I would call an ethical will. It's completely different than an estate plan. And will is even a little bit deceiving. Let's call it a legacy letter for your loved ones, because, there's a chapter in my current book called Nobody Wants Your Crap, right? Which I wanted to call the whole book, but the editor said it was slightly, it lacked elegance, I think is how she put it. The truth is that we spend so much of our lives focused on amassing capital and material goods. And we all have estate plans. We've spent a lot of time and money thinking about how are we going to bequeath our stuff to the people we love when we're gone. Guess what? Your kids and grandchildren don't want most of that stuff, okay? The goodwill won't even take half of it. And the money isn't going to sustain them in terms of your soul, of being able to be worthy of your soul, right? So think of the workshop we're going to do as a way for financial advisors to help their clients and themselves think through the values and the beliefs and the principles they want to bequeath to their loved ones, which, by the way, they will need much more than your typewriter collection or your paperweight collection or your pen collection or your jewelry, or the classic car or whatever the hell it is, you're going to leave that's physical. They're going to need your words much more than your stuff. And so that's what we're going to be talking about in Chicago, assuming that we can still travel with COVID. Otherwise, we'll do it virtually. Yeah. We're going to be talking about the things to ask of ourselves and answer for ourselves so that we leave a beautiful non-material legacy for the people we love. You know, I didn't know my last conversation with my father was my last conversation with my father. I didn't know that the next time I visited, he would no longer speak. And so it's true that you really never know. And it's really true that this is what children talk about, adult children. You know, I do many of these things that rabbis call intake meetings, where we sit with families before a funeral to learn about the person from their perspective, even if I knew the person very well. You want to know what kids remember? They don't remember the stuff. They remember the sayings, the laughter, the moments. That's what they remember. And it's easy to get lost in the material, especially when your life is about amassing capital.
Another personal anecdote, I made a decision when my kids were growing up. I have triplet sons and a daughter, that I would spend time with them growing up because and then when they left, I would go back to work and put my nose to the grindstone. But I always thought that if I were to die young, they would have a sense of who I was and what I stood for and what my values were, instead of who was that guy that used to leave on Mondays and come home on Friday nights?
Yeah. And you know something, I spend a lot of time in cemeteries, obviously. One of the things that, you were asked about, how do we remember to let death remain our teacher when the years pass? Well, I walk through cemeteries a lot, and I'm always struck by the fact that we all are unique individuals and lead unique lives, but our headstones, 98% of the headstones in a cemetery all say the same thing, that when you distill a person's life down to 15 characters per line and 4 lines, which is what they give you, when you engage in that form of essentialism, it reveals something about what matters and what doesn't. What's not on a headstone? Your net worth, where you went to college, your zip code, your grandchild's GPA, your typewriter collection. None of that's on your headstone. None of it. What's there?
Beloved husband,
father,
son,
friend, grandfather. That's it. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, friend. That's it. Now, can we live more in alignment with that reality? Because that's what I mean by the beauty of what remains. That's what remains.
We've covered a lot of ground. You mentioned that nobody wants your crap. Obviously, a lot of advisors have to deal with clients who maybe not in the extreme are hoarders, but have to come to the realization that maybe they need to get rid of their stuff before they die, so their kids don't have to deal with that crap.
Yeah. It's also, I think, as an advisor, you got to get down in that subconscious basement a little bit that we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
And really ask, why are these things important to this person? And usually it's because they have somehow convinced themselves that their outer life, what they have, is their inner life, that their outer life has real existential, spiritual worth and meaning. I tell people this is like trying to eat a picture of food. It's sort of satisfying. It's like...
Right. But it does validate you, does it not, to a degree, this stuff?
You know what? It does until it doesn't.
Yeah.
It does until you're shocked by some disruptive moment and you realize it's crap. Marshall McLuhan, the Canadian philosopher, he said, I don't know who discovered water, but it wasn't the fish.
Right.
Right? Because we're immersed in this culture that tells us that the material has real spiritual existential meaning, right? True religion genes, for example, right? You're in good hands with, right? Like a good neighbor, right? It's none of which is true.
Yeah.
Okay. But we're seduced by it. And when we're in that water, that's the world, that's the water we're swimming in, like the fish. We're born into it, we live in it, and we die in it. So we don't even know we're in it. When does a fish discover water?
Out of it.
Right. When it's yanked out with a hook and it's flailing and gasping for air, that's when a fish discovers water. Okay. That's what it takes. When do human beings discover that perspective? I'll tell you when there's a freaking gray spot on the MRI, when you're in the ambulance after a heart attack or a stroke, right? When you narrowly avoid the car accident. when you have a kid in trouble and no matter how much money you have, you don't know how to rescue him. Okay. These are the things that wake us up to the fact that we've been eating pictures of food. And suddenly now we have clarity about what matters, which of course isn't what, it's who. It's where we began.
In your prologue, you mentioned that you were 1 degree removed from the truth and that your dad described you as being full of blank.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the case any longer.
Well, I have, it sounds so strange to say this, but hopefully after this conversation, everyone will understand it in the spirit in which I intend it. My life is more meaningful and more beautiful because of my father's death. And is it worth it? No, I'd rather have one more dinner and one more conversation, but we don't get to choose that part. That's not in our hands. The only thing we get to choose is whether or not we're going to be worthy of what we have endured and lead a life worthy of what we have endured. That's our choice. And are we going to help others find that meaning and that beauty? Those are our choices. I'll tell you a great Chinese proverb that I love. If you want to be happy for an hour, take a nap. If you want to be happy for a day, go fishing. If you want to be happy for a month, get married. No comment. If you want to be happy for a year, inherit a fortune. If you want to be happy for a lifetime, help another person. Have a human connection.
So I have a great deal of gratitude for the opportunity to chat with you for all this time. Is there anything that we haven't touched upon that you think worth mentioning, or anything that you've already mentioned that you might want to reemphasize before we wrap up?
This sounds like enlightened self-interest, but it really isn't. I'm never going to out earn the advance on this book. So the money is irrelevant from book sales at this point. Don't wait until you need it to read the book. Read it and then go back to it. It's really a field guide. It's really meant to help people when they reach their hand out. It's my hand reaching back. And don't wait. And if you know someone who's suffering a loss, give it to them. We talked about this, but if I had to come up with a single imperative for everyone who's listening, when you witness another person in pain, another person suffering, just show up. The rest is commentary.
Well, I hope a lot of people show up for your presentation in Chicago, and if they don't, I hope they listen to our podcast, Rabbi Leder. So.
I do too. Thank you, Bob. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. I really do. Thank you.
Thank you. To hear more from Rabbi Leder, register for the Institute's upcoming Wealth Advisor Forum, in person or on demand, September 13th through the 14th, 2021 in Chicago, Illinois. The Wealth Advisor Forum combines the best parts of an industry conference, networking, presenter interactions, engagement and content, with the best parts of executive education, tenured professors, thought leadership, and research. Develop new skills and strategies to better serve your wealthy clients and earn an exclusive certificate of completion from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. To see the full speaker lineup and get more information, visit investmentsandwealth.org/WAF 2021.